3 I sang a hymn the Amish bishop had forbidden. My father stopped speaking to me. My father had a voice like low thunder, steady, unhurried, the kind that filled a room without trying. When I was small, I used to press my ear against the wall of the kitchen just to hear him lead the family in morning prayer. Not because I was pious, because his voice made me feel that the world had an order to it, and that somewhere inside that order, I belonged. He stopped speaking to me on a Tuesday in November. I was 19 years old. The temperature had dropped overnight, and the fields beyond our property had gone the color of ash. I remember the cold specifically because I stood in it for a long time after he turned away from me in the doorway, not crying, not moving, just standing there while the wind pulled at my cap and my hands went numb inside my apron. Pockets, I had sung a hymn, that was all I had done. One hymn in a room full of people who knew exactly which hymn it was and exactly why Bishop Amos Graber had declared it forbidden 3 months before. I had opened my mouth and let it out, and by the time the last note settled into the rafters, I had lost my father without fully understanding why. What I didn't know then, what took me years to piece together, was that the hymn was never really the reason. It was the final key in a lock that other people had been quietly turning for a very long time. And the hands turning it were not always the ones I suspected. I grew up in a district in eastern Ohio, the third of 5 children. Our community sat between 2 ridgelines, close enough to a county road that English cars passed by our fence twice a day, distant enough that most of us could go a full week without speaking to anyone outside our faith. My father, Elias Schrock, was a carpenter by trade and a deacon by calling. He was not the bishop, that distinction mattered enormously in our community, but he was the kind man the bishop consulted, quiet, respected, never the first to speak in a room and never the last to be heard. My mother, Ruth, was softer in manner but not in conviction. She baked bread every Monday and Thursday, kept the house in an order that felt almost ceremonial, and loved her children in the way that many women in our community loved, steadily and without much demonstration. I never doubted she loved me. I also never fully understood her until it was too late to ask her the right questions. The hymn in question was called Gott ist die Liebe. God is love. It had German roots older than our community's memory, and for most of my childhood it appeared in no forbidden list. No bishop's proclamation, no disciplinary meeting. It was simply a hymn, one my grandmother had sung to me. The one I associated with winter mornings and the smell of wood smoke and the feeling that faith was something warm rather than something watchful. Bishop Graber banned it in August of the year I turned 19. The announcement came after Sunday service, delivered in the flat, the unhurried tone that Bishop Graber used for everything from harvest schedules to formal shunnings. He said only that the hymn had been brought to his attention as a source of Unordnung, disorder, and that it would no longer be sung in our district's worship gatherings or in any home that wished to remain in good standing. No explanation was given, no question was invited. My father sat 3 rows ahead of me and I watched the back of his neck. He did not move. I thought it was strange. I did not yet think it was dangerous. The first person who tried to warn me was not my mother. It was my older sister, Hannah. Hannah was 23 that August, already married 2 years to a man named Joseph Yoder, already living in the house 2 properties east of ours, already wearing the careful expression that young wives in our community learned to wear. Pleasant at the edges, unreadable in the center. Hannah had always been the daughter who understood the rules, not as burdens but as architecture. She knew which walls were load-bearing and which ones you could lean against without consequence. She came to me 3 days after the bishop's announcement, found me picking beans in the garden, and crouched beside me in the dirt without preamble. "Leave it alone, Sarah." I asked her what she meant. "The hymn. I see the way you looked during the announcement. Leave it alone." I told her I hadn't planned to do anything. That was mostly true. I had hummed it twice in the kitchen without thinking, but humming wasn't singing. And the kitchen wasn't a gathering. Hannah looked at me for a long moment with that careful expression of hers, and then she said something I stored away without understanding. "This isn't only about the song." She stood up, brushed the soil from her dress, and walked back toward the road. I watched her go and told myself she was being dramatic. Hannah had always been cautious in ways that struck me as excessive. I loved her, but I had spent most of my life interpreting her warnings as the particular anxiety of someone who had married young and needed the rules to feel stable. I was wrong about that, but I would not understand how wrong for another 2 months. September passed quietly. I worked, I prayed, I attended service. The hymn's absence from our worship felt like a missing tooth, noticeable mostly when your tongue moved to the familiar place and found nothing there. It was during a quilting afternoon at the Byler farm that I first heard the name Miriam Lapp spoken in a whisper. Miriam Lapp had left our district 4 years before I was born. I knew her only as a name attached to a particular silence, the kind of silence communities produce around a person they have collectively agreed not to discuss. When someone mentioned her, the conversation moved on quickly, the way water moves around a stone without acknowledging it. That afternoon, I heard 2 older women, Edna Beeler and Clara Troyer, speaking in the corner near the window. I was not meant to hear. I was threading a needle and they had forgotten I was close. She used to sing it at every gathering, Clara said. Every single one. Even after the first warning, Edna made a sound of agreement. Amos never forgave her for that. It wasn't the singing itself, you understand. It was that she kept singing after he told her to stop. They noticed me then. The conversation ended the way those conversations always ended, with a redirect toward thread color or weather or someone's new baby. But the name Miriam Lapp had attached itself to something in my mind like a burr to wool, and I couldn't shake it free. I asked my mother that evening who Miriam Lapp was. My mother was at the stove. She did not turn around. Someone who made poor choices, she said. Set the table, please. That was all. But I noticed that her hand paused over the pot for just a moment before she stirred again, a small hesitation, almost nothing. I filed it away beside Hannah's warning without yet knowing they belonged to the same story. The October brought the harvest and a series of community work gatherings that pulled most of our district together for long, busy days. It was at one of these gatherings, a barn raising at the Stoltzfus property, that I met Thomas Lapp. He was 26, visiting from a district in Indiana to help a cousin with the construction. He was not from our community, which meant he carried a certain lightness around him, an ease that came from not having grown up beneath Bishop Graber's particular gravity. Spoke for perhaps 20 minutes across a table of food while our respective families circulated around us. He had his mother's last name. I realized, and I mentioned Miriam Lapp without thinking. The change in his face was immediate. Not anger, something closer to exhaustion, the expression of someone who has explained a painful thing many times and grown tired of the explaining. She was my aunt, he said quietly. My father's sister. I told him I had heard her name recently in connection with the hymn Bishop Graber had banned. Thomas was quiet for a moment. He looked around the table, with the careful habit of someone who had learned early to check who was listening. Then he said, "She didn't just sing it. She wrote one of the verses." I sat with that for a moment. "A verse of God ist die Liebe?" The third verse. "The one about God's love being larger than any house we build for it." He paused. Bishop Graber cut that verse out of the version our community used years ago. Miriam kept singing the whole hymn, every verse. She said it was her grandmother's work and she wouldn't pretend part of it didn't exist. What happened to her? He looked at his hands. She was shunned, left the district. My father hasn't spoken her name in 20 years. He glanced up at me. I'd be careful if I were you. Whatever's made that hymn a topic again. It isn't finished. I walked home that evening with his words sitting heavily on me, and for the first time I felt the shape of the thing I had been circling without knowing it. The ban on the hymn was not new. It was not really about disorder at all. It was about Miriam Lapp and a verse she had written, and a bishop who had spent decades making sure that verse stayed buried. What I still did not understand was why my family was part of it. I found out about my father's role in the original shunning by accident, the way most important things in closed communities are discovered, not through confession, through a document left in a place it shouldn't have been. My mother sent me to my father's workshop in early November to retrieve a ledger she needed for a household account. I found the ledger on his workbench. I also found beneath it folded paper that had slipped partially free, a formal notation in the careful handwriting used for district records. I should not have read it. I read it. It was a record of the shunning vote for Miriam Lapp dated 23 years earlier. There were 4 signatures from the deacons who had seconded Bishop Graber's decision. My father's name was one of them. I folded the paper back exactly as I had found it, placed the ledger on top, and carried it to my mother. I said nothing. She looked at my face and said nothing either. We existed in that shared silence, through supper, through evening prayers, through the sound of my father reading from Corinthians in his low, steady voice. Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, and have not charity, I am become as sounding brass, or a tinkling cymbal. I lay awake that night and rebuilt everything I thought I understood. My father had not merely sat quietly during Bishop Graeber's announcement in August. He had participated in the original punishment of the woman whose verse was being erased. He had signed his name to her exclusion, and now, 23 years later, the bishop had revived the ban, which meant something had stirred the old wound. Something, or someone, had reminded Amos Graeber that one verse of a hymn still circulated in memory even if it had been cut from the page. I thought about Miriam Lapp, who had refused to sing a shortened hymn. I thought about her nephew Thomas, who had warned me with tired eyes that whatever was happening wasn't finished. I thought about Hannah's voice in the bean garden. Isn't only about the song. And I thought about the gathering scheduled for the following Saturday at the Hochstetler farm. An informal singing, the kind our community held 6 or 7 times a year, where the rules about repertoire were technically the same as always, but the atmosphere was easier, the oversight slightly less formal. I made my decision slowly, the way you make decisions when you know they will cost something you cannot replace. I want to be honest about what I was feeling the morning of that gathering. I was not brave in the way that word is usually meant. I was not defiant. I was not staging a protest. I was a 19-year-old girl who had spent 3 months watching a piece of her grandmother's faith get buried under the weight of one man's pride and her own father's signature. And something in me had simply reached the place where silence felt like participation in a lie. I knew what I was risking. I was not naive enough to think otherwise. The singing began after the meal. As it always did, voices lifting together into the familiar Ausbund hymns, the room full of faces I had known my entire life. My father sat across the room near the men's side, his eyes on the page in front of him. Hannah sat 3 rows to my left. She found my face once, and I saw her expression shift, not to the careful blankness she usually wore, but to something raw and frightened and resigned, as though she had known this was coming and had been unable to stop it. When the current hymn ended and the brief silence opened before the next selection, I began to sing. Gott ist die Liebe, lässt mich erlösen. I sang all 3 verses, including the third. Including the verse that said God's love is larger than any house we build for it. The verse that Miriam Lapp's grandmother had written, and Miriam, the Lapp had refused to abandon, and Bishop Graeber had spent 2 decades pretending did not exist. The room did not erupt. That is the thing about these moments in closed communities. They do not erupt. They go very, very quiet. By the time I finished, the silence was absolute. 30 people in a warm room, and not one of them made a sound. Bishop Graeber was not present. That gathering was not formal enough for his attendance, but his absence did not make me safer. It only meant the report of what I had done would travel to him through other mouths before nightfall. My father looked at me across that room with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not shame, exactly. Something older and more private, the look of a man who recognizes a moment he has been dreading for a very long time. He turned away. He did not speak to me that evening. He did not speak to me the next morning. He did not speak to me the morning after that. Hannah came to me 4 days later. She sat across from me at the kitchen table while our mother moved quietly in the next room, and she told me what she had known since August and had been trying to warn me about without saying it plainly. Bishop Graeber had revived the ban not because the hymn had resurfaced organically. He had revived it because Miriam Lapp had written a letter to our community. After 23 years of silence, she had written to say that she was dying, a cancer in her lungs, and that she wished to return to our district once before she died. Not to be reinstated, not to make demands, only to see the place where she had grown up and to hear her grandmother's hymn sung whole. The bishop had denied the request and reimposed the ban as a signal that the matter was closed. My father had known about the letter. He had been one of the men the bishop consulted. He agreed with the decision, Hannah said. Her voice was steady in the way that steadiness sometimes means a person has already done their grieving. He told Bishop Graeber that revisiting the shunning would create more disorder than it prevented. He used that word, Unordnung, the same word the bishop used in his announcement. I thought about my father's voice filling the workshop, filling the kitchen, filling every room of my childhood with the sound of order and certainty. I thought about the signature on that folded paper. Did he know she was dying? I asked. Hannah looked at the table. Yes. The silence between us lasted a long time outside. The November wind moved through the bare branches of the oak tree our grandfather had planted. The year our father was born. He's not angry about the hymn, I said finally. It wasn't a question. No, Hannah said. He's afraid. He's been afraid since that letter arrived. You singing that hymn in front of 30 people. It makes what he agreed to into something that can't be kept quiet anymore. I asked her why she hadn't simply told me all of this in the bean garden. She looked up at me then. And for the first time in years I saw my sister without her careful expression, just her face, tired and sad and relieved to no longer be carrying it alone. Because I was afraid too, she said. I didn't want to be the one who told you. I thought if I warned you away from it, we could all just... She stopped. I'm sorry, Sarah, I should have been braver. I tried to speak with my father once, about 2 weeks after the gathering. I knocked on his workshop door, and he opened it and looked at me without expression and said, I have nothing to say to you. He closed the door. Not cruelly. That is the hardest part to explain to people who didn't grow up in our community. He closed the door the way you close a door on a room you have decided to seal, not with violence but with finality. My mother continued to speak to me. She fed me, she worked beside me, she prayed beside me. But she did not discuss my father, or the bishop, or Miriam Lapp, or what I had done. She loved me in her particular way, steadily and without demonstration, and she let the silence between her husband and her daughter exist in our home like a piece of furniture no one had agreed to remove. I wrote a letter to Miriam Lapp through Thomas, whose address I had managed to obtain through a quiet arrangement with the cousin he'd been visiting. I told her what I had done. I told her about her grandmother's verse, and the 30 silent faces and the November cold afterward. I told her I didn't know if it had helped anything. I told her I was sorry it had taken 23 years and a letter from a dying woman for anyone. The whole hymn in our district. She wrote back once 6 weeks later. The handwriting was uneven, pressed hard in some places and feather light. In others, the hand of someone whose strength came and went. She said, You gave it back to the air. That's all a song needs. She died the following March. I left our community when I was 22. Not because I was shunned. Bishop Graber never formally moved against me, perhaps calculating that my father's suffering was punishment enough. But because I had become someone the community wasn't sure what to do with. Dee and I had become someone who wasn't sure what to do with the community. The leaving was quiet and mutual and deeply painful. The way endings are when they involve people you love, even as you understand that love is not the same thing as belonging. My father and I did not speak for 11 years. The reconciliation when it came was incomplete. I want to be truthful about that. He was 68 years old, and his hands had the deep grooves of a carpenter's lifetime. And he sat across from me at Hannah's table, and we spoke carefully around the edges of what had happened. The way you walk carefully around an old injury that still aches in cold weather. He did not apologize for the shunning vote. He did not apologize for the silence, but he told me once, toward the end of an afternoon that had gone longer, and more honestly than either of us had planned, that he had thought about Miriam Lapp every year since she died, that he had not been able to sing Gott ist die Liebe, not even in his own mind, without hearing her grandmother's third verse, the one he had helped bury. I was wrong, he said, just those 3 words in that low, steady voice. About the letter, about what we owed her. He did not say he was wrong about me, but he had come to Hannah's table, and he had stayed the whole afternoon, and when he left he held my hand for a moment in both of his, the carpenter's hands, rough and warm and familiar as the walls of the house I had grown up in. I did not ask him for more than that. Some things cannot be fully recovered. Some silences, once they have lasted 11 years, leave a shape in the air around you that doesn't entirely disappear even after the silence ends. What I know now, standing on the far side of all of it, is that my father was not a cruel man. He was a frightened one. He had signed his name to something unjust, because the alternative was to stand against the man who gave his community its shape. And he did not have the particular kind of courage that requires. He had spent 23 years making peace with that choice in the only way, available to a man who could not undo it, by deciding the choice had been correct. And then his youngest daughter stood up in a room of 30 people and sang the third verse, and the choice stopped being something he could keep sealed in a folded paper beneath a ledger. I understand all of that now. Understanding is not forgiveness, and forgiveness is not erasure. I carry both the understanding and the grief, and most days I have made a kind of peace with carrying both. There is an oak tree in the yard of the house where I live now, not the same oak my grandfather planted, but similar in the way that certain things echo across a life without being identical. On winter mornings, when the branches are bare and the light comes in low and gray the way it does in eastern Ohio in November, I sometimes find myself humming without thinking. Gott ist die Liebe, all 3 verses, including the one about God's love being larger than any house we build for it. My father's voice was like low thunder, steady, unhurried, the kind that filled a room without trying. I still hear it sometimes when I am very quiet. I think I will always hear it. Silence he gave me changed something in me that did not change back, but it did not take his voice. That stayed. Some things we lose entirely. Some things we carry forward in a form we didn't choose and didn't expect. Smaller than what we started with, heavier than we imagined, and still, somehow ours.